Welcome back to a chilling night of stories. I'm a police officer in a small town in Texas, and I have some strange stories to tell. I've been a police officer in Mineral Wells, Texas for going on 5 years now. If you're wondering, Mineral Wells is about 50 miles west of Fort Worth and has a population of about 16,000. The people here are salt-of-the-earth type people, God-fearing, hard-working, and kind. But something has always been a little off about them, almost like they're carrying a secret that no one is supposed to know. Mineral Wells becomes a ghost town, no pun intended, after 7 p.m., and driving the streets at night can be downright creepy, even from the safety of my patrol car. In the 5 years I've been here, I've seen and heard some strange things I don't even believe myself at times. If I hadn't had my own strange experience when I was a child, I'd probably think I was crazy, but I'm not. The things that happen here are sometimes unexplainable, but they are real, and I'd like to relay one of my experiences to you. If you enjoy, perhaps I can tell you more, because I have a ton. To understand Mineral Wells, you first have to understand its history. I learned most of this after I visited the local historical society about 6 months after I moved here. Apparently, the town was settled in 1881 by a guy named J.A. Lynch Ochua. After Lynch dug the first drinking water well, he claimed that the strange-tasting water cured his rheumatism. Mrs. Lynch claimed that the water had cured her arthritis as well. Mineral-enriched water had prime medicinal value in the 1800s, and soon the word got out about its healing properties. A second well was dug several years later, and then a third. It was out of this third well that a woman with dementia often drank. Guess what happened? Her dementia was miraculously cured. The local children started calling this third well the Crazy Water Well, and eventually the term crazy water was coined for the miraculous water that flowed from the earth. News about this crazy water spread far and wide, and by the early 1900s, Mineral Wells had become the South's greatest health resort, with hundreds of mineral wells, bathhouses, spas, hotels, and the like. People traveled from all over the country in hopes of experiencing the healing power of the crazy water themselves. As you'd probably imagine, many of these visitors were old or infirm, and many never made it out of town alive. Today, Mineral Wells is a shadow of its former self. While it still has some industry, it operates mainly as a tourism and retirement community. But don't let that fool you. In this town, Faulkner's famous quote holds deeper meaning for those of us who choose to call it our home. The past is never dead. It's not even past. After I had been on force for about a month, I had my first experience with the strangeness of Mineral Wells. We had gotten a frantic 911 call about a dead body. I still remember the address, 200 Hubbard Street, the address of the Baker Hotel. I was working nights at the time. Apparently, that's where the rookies start. And the call came in about 12:30 a.m. My partner and I were in the area, and it didn't take us very long to get there. When we arrived, the 911 caller was gone, but the body was there, just as described. It turned out to be a young woman. She was splayed out on the red brick steps that led up to the front entrance, her back obviously broken and her head completely smashed. Also, she was totally nude. It was the first dead body I had seen, and it was gruesome. You didn't have to be an expert to determine she had fallen from a great height. I remember looking up to see if there were any balconies that she could have fallen from. There weren't, but there were plenty of windows, and since this was an old hotel, they didn't have the safety features that modern-day hotel windows have. In fact, many of the windows were open. I later learned the Baker Hotel had been shut down in the 70s, but no one would ever admit as to why. We secured the scene and called in the investigative unit. The girl turned out to be 29-year-old Pamela Allen. She had been a resident of Mineral Wells all her life and worked as a manager at a local cafe. On the night in question, Pamela had been with some girlfriends at a bar that was near the hotel. One of the girls who had been with her told the investigators that they had all been hanging out on the 7th floor of the hotel drinking after the bars closed when they suddenly realized that Pamela was nowhere to be found. They began looking for her and found her clothes in a pile in one of the rooms next to an open window. That's when they realized that she had fallen and called 911. There were only two bits of information they could offer. The first was that Pamela had been overheard saying she needed to go meet Virginia, but none of them knew any friend of hers by that name. The second was that there were rumors in town that she had been having an affair with the owner of the cafe she worked at, but none of them admitted to ever seeing her with him. When I heard all this, it seriously disturbed me. By all accounts, Pamela was a well-adjusted young woman and had no reason to kill herself. Why did she do it? And why did she take all of her clothes off before jumping? After the full investigation, I didn't hear much about the case again. The investigators thought the circumstances were odd, but odd things happened in Mineral Wells, and they had more pressing cases. The case was closed. It wasn't until about 5 months later, as I was poring over manuscripts at the Historical Society's archives, that I came across a passage that made the hair stand up on my neck. Here's what it said. One story involving the Baker Hotel revolves around a woman known as Virginia Brown, a resident at the hotel, who was the alleged mistress of T.B. Baker, the owner and builder of the hotel. This freaked me out, and I was about to nope right on out of there, but before I did, I realized there was a reference to another document. It turned out to be the hotel's ledger from the mid-1900s. I searched for Virginia Brown's name and found it. She had been a resident at that time, and there was a notation under the room heading, Room 714. It was then I knew there was something extremely strange going on in Mineral Wells, Texas. But what exactly? Incidentally, I would later find that the Baker Hotel is still relatively famous nationally, and I think one of those ghost story TV shows even did an episode on it. Story 2. One day, about 4 months after the incident at Baker Hotel, my partner and I were called to a disturbance at the Veterans Affairs building on C6th Ave. Sometimes we would switch shifts with the day patrol, and this was one of those days. When we arrived, there was a crowd of people outside, most of whom looked visibly shaken. As we approached the door, I understood why. The sounds coming from inside were downright terrifying. Deep, guttural moans and screams emanated through the air. The sounds were so unnatural that we could not make an initial determination whether the person making them was male or female. If I'm being honest, at the time I was unsure about whether they were even human. We entered into the foyer with pistols drawn and quickly cleared it and the surrounding rooms. All of the employees had made it outside, which was good. I immediately noticed the air inside had a strangely cold, damp quality to it, unheard of for summer in Texas, even with the air on. And maybe it was just my imagination, but the sounds seemed to not only be coming from the office at the back of the building, but also from the walls around us. And what was that other thing? Whispers? I glanced at my partner, but he seemed wholly focused on the door in front of us. We moved forward to check the handle and found that it was locked. We announced ourselves, but it was soon clear the person inside had no interest in opening the door. My partner, being larger, leaned back and then drove his foot right into the handle of the door, breaking the door frame and sending the cheap door flying inwards. For a split second, and I know this sounds crazy, but I could have sworn the man inside was wearing a long white doctor's coat and white mask over his mouth. A half second later, the image in my mind was gone, and before us stood a visibly disturbed older gentleman wearing green fatigues and brandishing a letter opener. It was one of those relatively large but dull kinds like you get from the Rotary Club. What little hair he had left was sticking straight out from his head, like when you rub your hair against a balloon. He was babbling, mostly incoherently, but we could make out a few words between the moans and cries. Not the water again, not the water. It's cold, so cold. It's time for your treatment. I'm a better boy, so much better. I want run. I want. He moved quickly, raising the hand with the letter opener. My partner yelled out, "Drop it!" as we aimed our firearms in unison. Then, without warning, the man placed his hand palm down on the desk next to him and drove the letter opener into the back of his hand with such force that it somehow pierced the wood on the desk. He looked straight at us with that pale face, eyes cold and wide with fear, and gasped, "He's coming," and collapsed to the floor. I stayed with the man while my partner ran outside to grab the paramedics. When I was doing my final sweep of the office, I happened to notice a large, half-empty box of mineral water collected and bottled right here in town by the Crazy Minerals Company. I grabbed a bottle and shoved it into my pocket. As the paramedics were wheeling him out, their initial explanation for his actions was possible early signs of dementia, by the way. My partner called my attention to a small brass sign that had been erected on the outside of the building. It read, Filling Sanitarium National Register of Historic Places Mineral Wells, Texas 1929. After the incident at Veterans Affairs, I wanted to learn all I could about mineral wells, and about a week later, I went to the Historical Society on my day off, as I mentioned in part 1, to learn about its unusual history. Later that night, I found myself alone, as usual, in my apartment, deep in thought. I tried not to think about what had happened with the old man, but I couldn't push it from my mind. It was so strange, and the fact that the building had been a sanitarium at one point made it even stranger. At this point, I wasn't even sure I believed in ghosts or the undead, but what had happened sure pointed to some kind of possession. The only thing I really knew was that I had experienced 2 otherworldly events, neither of which seemed to be connected, but together seemed to point to something sinister going on in mineral wells. What was causing these terrible things to happen, and what connection did they have, if any, to the history of the town? And what did the crazy water have to do with it? I considered leaving mineral wells briefly, but then scrapped that idea. I was going to stay and do what I was hired to do, which was to protect and serve the citizens of the great state of Texas. And possibly, if I was lucky, start figuring out the grand secret that seemed to be lurking just beneath the surface. I decided that plan would start with my partner, Officer James Orr, a 15-year veteran of the Mineral Wells Police Department, and a lifelong resident of Mineral Wells. The next night, while on patrol, I brought up the subject of the man at Veterans Affairs to James. Crazy old man, huh? He said. He almost got himself shot. Did you notice anything strange about him? I asked pensively. At this point, I wasn't planning on admitting what I had thought I had seen and heard, fearing he would think I was a lunatic. Other than the fact that he stabbed himself with a dull letter opener, not really. It was a little cold in that office, but that's not that odd. Weird shit like that happens in mineral wells sometimes. He laughed as he said it, so I was pretty sure he didn't buy into it being anything out of the ordinary. You drink that stuff? I asked. I certainly didn't and wasn't planning to anytime soon. Sure, everyone here drinks it. It has an odd taste, but you get used to it. My grandmother's family moved here in the 1920s, believe it or not, to see if the crazy water would cure her mother's, my great-grandmother's, schizophrenia. It was a snake oil salesman's heyday back then. The mineral water was supposed to cure anything and everything, and I know my great-grandmother had to make great sacrifices to get here. I'm not sure whether it worked or not, but she died here sometime after giving birth to my grandmother in 1931. I still have an old picture of her standing in front of one of the crazy water wells. You know, it's funny, and I haven't admitted this to anyone before, so don't think I'm crazy. But several years before you got here, I responded to a strange call involving an old woman who had taken too many of her pills and was worried that she was going to die. Ellie, I think her name was. After I arrived, I called poison control to make sure she was going to be okay. The woman on the line stated that Ellie should get checked out if she started feeling ill, but that the quantity of what she took was not lethal. I comforted her a bit and was about to leave, but she stopped me dead in my tracks with a peculiar story. She said that as she was about to take her pills, a young lady had instructed her to take the entire bottle, dump M all down my throat, as she had put it. For some reason, she had listened, and had taken about a fourth of the bottle before snapping out of it. Confused, I asked her who the young lady was. She said, matter-of-factly, the lady that watches me through the window. Dull. Odd, right? So naturally, I asked her which window it was, and she said it was the one in her bedroom. Now, this lady was probably in her 80s, and most likely demented, but I still wanted to check and make sure no one was in the house. I walked back to the bedroom and opened the door, and for a split second I thought I saw a face in the window across from the bedroom door. The next moment, it was gone. I searched the room, the closet, and the bathroom, but no one was there. Aside from a slightly strange smell, which I attributed to the age of the house and its contents, nothing was amiss. I checked outside, no one to be found. The place was empty, except for the owner, and there was no sign that anyone had been inside the home. The craziest thing, the face I saw, I swear, I will go to the grave with this memory. It was the exact same face I've seen 1,000 times, standing in front of that damn mineral well. It was my great-grandmother's. Story 3. After James confided in me about his experience with his great-grandmother's ghost, we didn't really talk about things like again for a while. Even though he believed he may have experienced something and had most likely seen other odd things in his time as a police officer, he still didn't really believe in the paranormal, although he wanted to. Almost like there was a veil in front of his eyes which prevented him from seeing what was really happening in mineral wells. I, on the other hand, had abandoned all hope of talking myself out of believing in this stuff. I was fully invested. I had my next run-in about a year later. James was out sick, the flu I believe, and I responded to a vagrancy call at the old Norwood hospital. It had been abandoned for some time, and we had gotten constant reports that a man was living on the 3rd floor and making a racket at all hours of the night. Initially, the MWPD had sort of looked the other way, the reason for which I was not privy to, but this time I was told to go over there immediately and get him out of there if possible. I arrived just after 10:00 p.m. and parked my squad car across the street. The Norwood Hospital had been built sometime around 1904, I believe, when Dr. Norwood and his wife had moved to Mineral Wells. It was used as a private hospital, as far as I know. And Dr. Norwood apparently even had some tie to T.B. Baker, but I couldn't recall what it was. As I was walking up to the entrance, I noticed the flicker of a light in the 3rd-story window, most likely a candle, confirming that someone was up there. The front door was still boarded up, but there was a window on the left side of the front of the building that had been broken and all of the glass removed. I pulled out my flashlight and climbed in. The inside of the building had decayed with age, and all of the signs you'd expect in a vagrancy were present. There were old clothes on the floor, empty food containers, beer cans, and the place was in extremely poor condition. The smell was awful too. I checked the 1st floor and found nothing. There was an open door that appeared to lead to a basement, but I decided that would not be on my agenda for the night. The 2nd floor was much like the 1st, except there was also a room that looked like it may have been a nursery or a child's playroom, littered with old stuffed toys, a rocking horse, and several rotting bunk beds. Just as you'd expect, it creeped me out royally. When I got to the stairs that led to the 3rd floor, I heard something rustling up in the darkness above me. I'm not going to lie, I was not real happy about having to go up there, but the top brass had made it clear that I needed to take care of this tonight. "It's the police," I announced to the black void. "If you're up there, I need you to come down." I sat in silence for a minute, listening. Nothing but the wind outside. I began to slowly ascend the stairs with my flashlight as my guide and my hand on my hip. I swung my flashlight across the room and saw a figure, huddled in the corner under several blankets covering his face. I began to walk towards him cautiously. I smelled the man before I really saw him. But once I did, I realized the smell was more desirable. He appeared to be in his 50s, but I had the feeling he was much younger. His fingers were gnarled and his face bore the mask of addiction and depression. When he began to mumble, I noticed his teeth were black and crumbling. "Mariana, is that you?" Something indecipherable. "Take me? Now?" "Mighty Bernard. Sir, I need you to show me your hands." "What are you doing up here?" I said. This time, he spoke more loudly. "The children, they won't leave me alone. The poor children, they are missing pieces. Are you here to take me?" "The children are always playing. They are never quiet. They went to meet the doctor. The water didn't help. They always tell me. I never sleep. Are you here to take me?" There had obviously been no children in this building for quite some time, but maybe his encounter with them had been of a different sort. I stood the man up and searched his person. finding $2 in one pocket and a burnt-up piece of tin foil in the other. I checked his fingers, and sure enough, he had the telltale signs of long-term methamphetamine use, burnt fingers and all. Meth had always been a relatively serious problem in Mineral Wells. It's cheap, it can be made with mostly household chemicals, and once they start, they can't escape its grip, often for life. I threatened to arrest him for possession of paraphernalia, but he agreed to tell me where he got the meth from instead. Lions Park, as the dopeheads called it, a place well known for its drug activity. He didn't have any of it on it, but I did explain to him that he'd be arrested for trespassing. He seemed relieved as I escorted him down the third-floor stairs. Back on the second floor, I noticed something I hadn't before, scrawled in some dark substance on the wall at the bottom of the stairs. The man, Victor was his name it would turn out, noticed it too and just started quietly sobbing to himself. We exited as quickly as possible. As I drove off toward the station, I recalled that I had seen a light in the third-floor window when I had first arrived. However, there hadn't been any candles, lit or otherwise, when I had gotten up there. I glanced in my rear-view window at the old hospital receding in the background, expecting to see only darkness, but instead, the telltale spark of a candle flickered back, the wind in the trees carrying the faint laughter of children. The Norwood Hospital circa 1904, before the third floor was added, later, the writing on the wall. Several days later, I paid my first visit to Mary Scott. Miss Scott was known in the community as being a reputable source on Mineral Wells lore, as well as for her discretion. She had taught at one of the local schools in the 70s and 80s, and had retired to her small but well-kept estate on the south side of town, outside the city limits. James had actually set us up. She had taught him in kindergarten and then again in middle school. The Norwood incident had pushed me into full investigation mode, and I needed some answers. I believed this was as good a start as any. I arrived at her place in mid-afternoon, dressed in plain clothes so as not to attract any attention to myself. Now that I was actively seeking information on paranormal activity in Mineral Wells, I had to be extra careful. At this point, I wasn't even entirely sure I could trust this woman, but I didn't really have any choice. Her home was a small, cozy brick house tucked several hundred feet off the road. A narrow driveway guided me under the sprawling arms of several mature oaks. There was a small pond off to the side with a weathered dock and several dogs panting about. I knocked on the door and was quickly greeted by a woman who appeared to be in her 60s, considerably shorter than me, and just beginning to gray around her temples, with kind eyes and knowing smile. A teacher for sure, and someone who seemed to be wise beyond her years. She invited me in, and with a "thank you, ma'am," I graciously accepted. After some small talk about James and my move to Mineral Wells, we sat down in the living room with our iced teas and got down to business. "What can I help you with, dear?" she asked. Scott, Mary. Sorry, I'm not exactly sure how to put this, but I'm just going to come out and say it. I've experienced some things in Mineral Wells that I can't quite explain rationally, I said with hesitation. "Go on," she said knowingly. "Well, there's something odd about Mineral Wells. I've encountered spirits or people possessed by spirits multiple times since I started work here. The problem is, no one else sees them. Does that sound crazy?" "Tell me something," she started. "Do you drink the mineral water, the crazy water as they call it?" "No, I don't," I said. "I have a bottle at my apartment, but it's currently unopened." "Good. Keep it that way," she said, sipping her tea. "Most of what I know comes second and third hand from stories passed down through the generations, and the rest from countless hours studying old deeds, contracts, journal entries, and any other documents I could get my hands on. You're right, something is rotten in Mineral Wells, Mineral Hells as I call it. And it all started with that cursed mineral water old man Lynch summoned from the ground all those years ago. By all accounts, he was a sociopath and a scoundrel. I don't drink it either anymore, and from what I have gathered, that's what allows people like us to actually see what's actually going on. Most of the locals have lived on it all their lives. It's made them blind to the true face of this godforsaken town. It also may make them more susceptible to suggestion, even possession, by the other side. Nah. Suddenly, several things made sense at once. Pamela was born in Mineral Wells and lived here her entire life, and I would venture a guess that Ellie and the man at the VA had too. It also made sense now why James wasn't able to come to grips with the things he had seen. "What's wrong with the water?" I asked. "That's a good question. I believe Mr. Lynch tapped into more than he bargained for when he dug that first mineral well. It sparked a chain of events that has somehow caused the dead to remain in mineral wells long after they have passed. The water itself does have extremely high levels of lithium, but I suspect there is something more to it that causes folks to turn a blind eye to the influence the spirits have on our world. There are others, though, like us, that know the truth." "Mary, there is so much more that I want to know," I started, now getting excited. "Do you know anything about Dr. Norwood? I have a feeling he is somehow involved in all of this." "No, not much. Only whispers here and there. A name kept coming up. Marianne, I believe." "Mariana?" I asked, remembering the name hellishly scrawled on the hospital wall. "Yes, that's it, Mariana," she went on. "She was Dr. Norwood's head nurse for much of the time the hospital was open. I believe he was an osteopath by trade, but there were rumors that something else was going on there. What exactly, I'm not sure. Many years ago, I heard the records are said to be hidden somewhere in the building," she went on, but the sound of her voice faded from my consciousness and was replaced by a singular picture: the dingy wooden stairs leading down into the basement at the Norwood Hospital. If the records were still in the building, they were down there. Finding them was the first step in unlocking this mystery. I had to find them. I reluctantly cut our conversation short, thanking Mary and telling her we would meet again. I promised to share any further information I found with her. I got the feeling as I was leaving that she had stuck her neck out by talking to me, and I was grateful for her help. As I drove back down the long driveway under those old oaken sentinels, picturing Mary alone with her tea and her dogs, I felt a feeling of sadness and weight envelop me like being wrapped in a thick blanket on the bottom of the ocean. I drove on. That night, I parked my squad car across the street from the Norwood, as I had several days earlier. I was on the clock and could easily explain my purpose for being here if questioned about it. And sure enough, as I stepped out of my vehicle, I could see the light again, flickering in the third-floor window like a modern-day will-o'-the-wisp. I opened the trunk and grabbed the black satchel inside. Once inside the building, I navigated through the grime and decay to the black hole in the wall that led down to the basement. Thank God for flashlights, I thought. The darkness there seemed palpable, like it was a living entity all its own. I started down the steps, 10 in all, and counted each as I went. If I were to lose my light source for any reason, or if I was running, I'd at least have a decent chance of getting back up the stairs without falling and hurting myself. I had also noted that it was 22 steps roughly from the door to the basement stairs. You can never be too careful. Once I made it down, I felt the grit of soil beneath my boots. I guess it made sense that the basement wasn't fully complete in a building as old as this. Surprisingly, it was relatively clean down there, but that was the only positive. The air was damp and musty and heavy with the weight of the building's history. As I swung my flashlight, the darkness retreated on cue, but grudgingly. Old equipment littered the floor, along with some decayed furniture and other furnishings. I didn't see any filing cabinets, though. No papers, folders, nothing. I cursed myself silently for thinking this was a good idea, but pressed on. The second room felt darker than the first somehow. A cabinet had overturned and there were broken vials and bottles littering the ground. I stepped around them and was surprised when there wasn't another door in front of me. Just an old coal stove, flanked on either side by piles of old bricks and some old rafters. The stairs to the basement were in the back of the building, and I knew I hadn't made it back to the front. I doubled back and made sure there were no other rooms or passageways before heading back to the room with the stove. I shined my light around. I noticed the back wall was brick, and that there was a crack running up from behind the stove halfway to the ceiling. Immediately, I began removing bricks from the pile in front of the wall, until I had enough room to slowly nudge the iron stove out of the way. It was just as I had thought. At some point, this basement had flooded, eroding the earth beneath the brick wall and causing the bricks to crack since the wall had no weight to hold it. I had done construction in the past and had seen this before. This wall had been built shoddily and probably in a hurry. At the bottom, the bricks weren't being held together by mortar at all, and a few light kicks created just what I needed to proceed. A passageway under the old brick wall into hell, for all I knew. My heart was pounding, and I absolutely did not want to go in. I have no trouble admitting that now. I had come too far to turn back, though. So, I got on my hands and knees and crawled through the small opening. As I stood up and dusted myself off, my heart froze in my chest. Filing cabinets, rows of them. They were similar to the kind offices used today, except they were made of solid wood, probably oak, and very well preserved for their age. They had brass plates on the outside with descriptions. The room appeared to be untouched after all these years. Mary had been right. I walked along the wall quickly, not wanting to waste any more time in this place than I had to, until I found the cabinet I was looking for, the one marked experimental. Experimental. The word itself seemed evil, somehow. I slowly opened it, and over the creak of wood sliding on wood, I thought I heard the faint laughter of children. A cold sweat broke out over the skin of my arms, and I got the feeling that I was being watched. I grabbed as many files as I could fit in my satchel, closed the drawer, and turned to leave. That's when I saw them. In the middle of the room, standing perfectly still, was a group of children. I was paralyzed, not by any external force, but by the grip of unadulterated fear. They looked back at me, eyes blinking almost in unison with gleeful smiles. Then, it was as if a record skipped and the children standing there changed. I recoiled in horror as I realized what I was seeing. The girl standing in front had 2 blank, scarred holes for her eyes. The younger boy next to her waved, his hand bearing only 2 fingers and a thumb. Another boy was on the floor, pulling himself forward with the stumps of 2 missing legs dragging behind. There were others in the same condition. The record skipped again and they were whole, all standing still again, grinning from ear to ear. I found my body could move again, so I turned and ran as fast as any human ever had before, crawling under the wall before sprinting the rest of the way out of that godforsaken building, back through the basement, 10 steps up, 22 steps out. As I ran, I heard the children singing behind me. As it got louder, I realized it wasn't a song, but a nursery rhyme, one that still haunts me to this very day. 1 for tongue and 2 for nose, 3 for eyes and 4 for toes. Ring the bell, the time is near. Ding dong, Mariana's here. Ding dong, Mariana's here.